Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into some sources today that, well, they really make you question the standard story of human history. We're looking at finds that seem completely out of place.
That's right. A lot of this discussion is going to draw from the book Forbidden Archaeology by Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson. It's sort of the core text here.
But not just that book.
No, we're also looking at other material discussing these out-of-place artifacts, OOPARTs, they sometimes call them, and even some recent discoveries that, while maybe more mainstream, still show how things are shifting.
Got it. So the mission is, let's explore the claims, the actual evidence presented in these sources. We want to get a handle on what these out-of-place things are, the arguments around them.
And especially that idea from the book about how scientific knowledge gets, well, filtered sometimes.
Right, how certain ideas get accepted and others don't.
Exactly. And just to be super clear up front, we're going to present the evidence and the arguments as they appear in this material we're looking at. Our job is to explore what these authors and discoverers claimed.
We're not endorsing, just exploring the perspectives and the sources.
Precisely. We're guides to this specific information, showing you the different viewpoints and the controversies discussed within it.
Perfect. So let's start with that term, out-of-place artifacts. OOPARTs. It sounds kind of dramatic. What's the basic idea?
Yeah, it does sound a bit sci-fi, maybe. But really, it just means an object, an artifact found in a geological or archaeological setting where, according to standard timelines, it just shouldn't be.
Like finding a smartphone in a dinosaur fossil. Okay, maybe not that extreme, but...
Yeah, something like that principle. It clashes with the accepted timeline of technology or culture, or even which species was around, it seems, out of place.
And the sources mention some examples that always seem to come up in these discussions, right? Though many are pretty controversial or even debunked.
Definitely. You often hear about the Koso artifact. Looked like a spark plug inside a rock.
An ancient spark plug.
That was the initial claim. But closer looks suggested it was a modern spark plug encased in a natural concretion, not millions of years old.
Okay, what else?
The Uca stones from Peru are another famous one. Stones engraved with dinosaurs, complex surgery, really wild stuff.
But generally considered fakes.
Yeah, the consensus is largely that they're modern carvings made for the tourist trade, though the story is complex.
And the crystal skulls. I remember hearing about those.
Them too. Sources mention they've been shown to be 19th century creations, likely German-made, not ancient Mesoamerican artifacts.
Okay, so not everything labeled an OOPART holds up.
Not at all. There are also the Ocambaro figures from Mexico, ceramic figures. Some look like dinosaurs. Authenticity is heavily debated. Most experts are very skeptical. And the Klerksdorp spheres, little metallic spheres from South Africa, incredibly old rock. Some claim they're manufactured because of grooves on them.
But geologists have explanations.
Geologists generally argue they're natural formations, concretions. So yeah, many famous cases are disputed or have explanations.
Right. But the main source we're digging into, Forbidden Archaeology, it goes way beyond these famous, maybe easily dismissed cases, doesn't it? It presents a much bigger pile of evidence.
It does. They argue that while some cases are debunked or explained, there's a vast amount of other evidence, often from scientific reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries, that points to something much more radical and has been, they claim, unfairly dismissed or forgotten.
Okay, so let's get to the core thesis of Forbidden Archaeology. What are Cremo and Thompson really arguing?
Their central argument is, well, pretty staggering. They compile evidence they believe shows that anatomically modern humans, people looking essentially like you and me, have existed on Earth for an incredibly long time.
How long?
Not just, the roughly 100,000 years or so that conventional anthropology suggests Homo sapiens emerged from more ape-like ancestors. They're talking millions, potentially hundreds of millions of years.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge claim. That throws the whole standard picture of human evolution out the window.
Completely. It implies humans like us might have coexisted with dinosaurs or even lived long before them, depending on which evidence you look at in their book.
And the book itself, how is it structured? Does it just list weird finds?
It's quite systematic, actually. Part I catalogs this huge amount of anomalous evidence, the stuff that contradicts the standard timeline.
Okay.
Part 2 then turns the tables and critiques the evidence that is generally accepted in paleoanthropology, the fossils that form the standard evolutionary sequence.
Interesting. And central to their whole argument is this idea of the knowledge filter. What exactly do they mean by that?
Right, the knowledge filter. They describe it not necessarily as some shadowy conspiracy, but more as an ingrained, ongoing social process within the scientific community.
A social process.
Yeah. The idea is that evidence which strongly contradicts the dominant accepted theories, in this case, about human origins and how old we are, gets systematically, almost automatically suppressed, ignored, or just forgotten over time.
So it's like the system protects the existing paradigm. Evidence that fits the story gets a pass, maybe even if it's a bit weak.
Exactly.
But evidence that breaks the story faces this massive wall of skepticism.
That's precisely the double standard they describe. Evidence supporting the current evolutionary narrative might be accepted with, let's say, less rigorous proof. But evidence challenging it has to meet an incredibly high bar, and even then, it's often dismissed.
Do the sources give a really clear historical example of this filter in action, someone actually saying something like that?
They pull out a quote from W.H. Holmes, who was a prominent figure at the Smithsonian back in the day. He was reacting to J.D. Whitney's reports of finding advanced stone tools in very old gold mine shafts in California.
What did Holmes say?
According to the source, Holmes essentially stated that if the facts, even a lot of facts, didn't agree with the accepted theory of human evolution, then those facts must be discarded.
Wow. Just discard the facts if they don't fit the theory. That's blunt.
It's presented as a stark example of prioritizing theory over reported observations.
And the authors argue this isn't just something that happened 100 years ago. They think this filtering still goes on.
Yes, they claim it's an ongoing issue. They recount, for example, difficulties their own research team supposedly faced trying to get access to certain museum artifacts for filming a TV show based on the book. And they describe a strong negative reaction from some mainstream scientists to that show even being aired, suggesting, in their view, a reluctance within parts of the establishment to even allow this counter-evidence to be presented publicly.
Fascinating. This idea that the way science works can sometimes screen out uncomfortable data. Okay, let's dive into the actual evidence they present in part 1. What kinds of finds are we talking about?
They start with a category they call anomalously old bones and shells that seem to show signs of human work.
Human work how? Like
Yeah.
tool marks.
Exactly. They cite reports, often from the 19th or early 20th century geological literature, describing animal bones or shells found in very old geological strata Pliocene, which is like 5 million years ago, Miocene, 525 million, even older sometimes. And these bones or shells reportedly had cut marks, incisions, or patterns of breakage that the original discoverers argued couldn't be explained by natural causes like animal teeth or just geological pressure. They concluded tools must have been used.
Is there one example that really stands out? Something visual?
There's one they highlight, a shell found in England in what's called the Red Crag Formation. This formation is Pliocene, over 2 million years old.
And what was special about this shell?
Apparently it had a carving on it, described as crude but recognizably a human face, found back in 1881.
A human face carved on a shell over 2 million years ago.
Yeah.
In England.
Yeah.
That's radically out of sync. Artistry like that in Europe is usually dated to maybe 30,000 or 40,000 years ago, right? And modern humans themselves maybe 100,000 years ago in Africa.
Precisely. It's the kind of find that directly contradicts the standard timeline of human capabilities and migrations. They use it as a prime example of suppressed evidence.
And they quote someone commenting on this type of find.
Yes, the French anthropologist Armand de Quatrefages. Discussing evidence like this back then, he apparently felt that the objections being raised against it were based more on theoretical considerations, meaning it didn't fit the theory, rather than on problems with the actual direct observation of the finds themselves.
Theoretical considerations overriding observation. There's that filter idea again. Okay, from bones and shells, let's move to stone tools. What about really early, maybe crude stone tools?
Right. They dedicate a lot of space to eoliths. That means dawn stones.
Dawn stones.
Yeah, basically the simplest imaginable stone tools, maybe just a natural flint flake where the edge was slightly chipped, perhaps intentionally, perhaps just through use to make it sharper or more functional.
And there was a big debate about whether these were real tools or just naturally broken rocks.
A huge, long debate. The authors argue strongly for their human origin, presenting evidence like the discoveries made by Benjamin Harrison on the Kent Plateau in England.
How old were those supposed to be?
The layers were dated to the middle or late Pliocene, potentially 2 to 4 million years old. And Harrison's finds were initially supported by big names in science at the time, like Alfred Russel Wallace, Morris, the co-discoverer of natural selection.
Okay. Anyone else finding these eoliths?
J. Reed Moore found many in that same Red Crag Formation in England, the one with the carved shell. His finds were dated even older, some potentially from the Pliocene-Miocene boundary, even Oligocene, so anywhere from 2 to maybe 55 million years old.
Wow.
And even Moore's finds gained significant support for a while. The famous French prehistorian Henri Breuil, a top expert on stone tools, apparently accepted many of them, as did an international commission of scientists who visited the sites.
But eventually, this eolith evidence was rejected by the mainstream.
Largely, yes. The sources discuss how later analyses, particularly using a method developed by A.S. Barnes that looked at the angles of flaking on the stone, were used to argue they were natural.
But the authors dispute that rejection.
They do. They point out that modern experts on stone tool technology have questioned the universal validity of Barnes's method. And this is where they bring up that double standard again.
How so?
They argue that very similar-looking, simple stone tools found in places like Olduvai Gorge in Africa, associated with early hominins like Homo habilis, are accepted by mainstream science without much fuss.
Because they fit the narrative. Africa, early humans, simple tools. It makes sense in the standard model.
Exactly. But similar or even identical-looking tools found in Europe from potentially the same time period or even much older, rejected as natural phenomena. Same tools, different continent, different conclusion driven by the prevailing theory, they argue.
That's a powerful point they're making. What about other disputed stone tool finds, maybe slightly more complex ones?
They discuss the work of Louis Leakey, a famous name in paleoanthropology, at a site called Calico in California.
Leakey found tools there.
He believes so. Stone objects that he and others interpreted as tools were found in deposits dated, controversially, to over 200,000 years old.
Which is way too old for the standard arrival time of humans in the Americas, right? That's usually put at more like 12,000 or maybe 15,000 years ago.
Precisely. The Calico finds, if genuine tools, would radically push back the peopling of the New World. Of course, many critics argue the Calico objects are just naturally fractured stones, geofacts, not artifacts, but the sources present the case for them being tools.
Okay, so we have these hints of maybe very early, simple tool use going back millions of years. But what about tools that look, well, more advanced, like something we'd associate with anatomically modern humans? Homo sapiens sapiens, found in these surprisingly old layers.
Yes, this is a crucial part of their argument. They present evidence of what they call very advanced stone implements found in contexts that seem impossibly old. Tools that really look like they should only have been made by people like us.
Where were finds like this reported?
A key site they focus on is Miramar in Argentina. Discoveries made primarily by Carlos Ameghino in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
What did he find there?
He reported finding stone tools, like bolus stones used for hunting, and even a stone arrowhead.
An arrowhead?
Yes. And crucially, some of these, including the arrowhead, were apparently found firmly embedded in the fossil bones of extinct Pliocene animals, like a toxodon.
Embedded in the bone, so not just loose in the same layer.
Correct, embedded within the bone itself. And the geological formation was dated to the Pliocene, which is, again, about 3 to 5 million years ago.
Bolus. Arrowheads. Those are pretty sophisticated hunting technologies. We usually associate them with modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens.
That's exactly the point Cremo and Thompson make. If these finds are legitimate, they imply people with modern capabilities were hunting in South America millions of years ago. They even mention a later find at the same site of a fossil jaw fragment described as fully human.
That's astounding if true. Is there any corroboration? I thought I read something in the notes about someone trying to disprove it.
Ah, yes, the story about Eric Bowman. He was a skeptical archaeologist who went to investigate Ameghino's claims. According to the account in the sources, Bowman was present when one tool was extracted. He then directed further digging nearby, presumably hoping to show the context was disturbed or the finds were fakes. But instead, 2 more similar stone implements were reportedly found, in place, embedded in the same undisputed Pliocene layer, right under his supervision.
So his attempt to debunk actually strengthened the case.
That's how the source presents it, yes, as evidence that the finds weren't easily dismissed as hoaxes or mistakes.
Okay, Argentina. What about other places? North America, maybe?
No.
Still challenging that 12,000-year entry date.
Definitely. They detail the work of Thomas E. Lee at a site called Shegianda on Manitoulin Island in Canada.
What did Lee find?
He excavated quite sophisticated stone tools, points, blades, scrapers that looked much more advanced than typical Paleo-Indian artifacts. They were found underneath glacial till layers.
Under the glacial deposit, so pre-glacial.
That was the implication. Geologists who studied the site dated the glacial deposits covering the tools to at least 65,000 years old, maybe as old as 125,000 years.
Which, again, is vastly older than the standard timeline for humans in North America.
Hugely older. And the sources recount a rather sad story about Lee's career after this discovery.
What happened?
They claim he faced significant professional obstacles, difficulty publishing his findings, loss of his position, the artifacts supposedly became inaccessible, and the site itself was eventually designated a tourist area rather than being preserved for further scientific study. The book quotes Lee expressing his belief that his discovery was deliberately suppressed because it fundamentally contradicted the established narrative and would, in his words, have forced the rewriting of almost every book.
That's a very strong accusation of the knowledge filter at work. It sounds like a similar pattern emerges with another site mentioned, Huayalaco in Mexico.
Yes, that's another major case they present. A team including geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre, associated with the U.S. Geological Survey, worked there in the 1970s.
What was found at Huayalaco?
Sophisticated stone tools, including projectile points, that looked quite advanced. They were found in layers associated with ancient stream deposits.
And the dating.
This is where I got really controversial. Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used multiple dating methods, uranium series dating on bone, zircon fission track dating on volcanic layers overlying the artifacts, and they consistently got very old dates.
How old?
Around 250,000 years old.
250,000 years. For advanced tools in Mexico.
Exactly. This date was problematic on multiple levels. It massively predated the accepted arrival in the Americas.
But also, 250,000 years ago was really early, even for Homo sapiens globally, right? The standard view puts our species emerging around 100,000 years ago in Africa.
Precisely. So this date challenged not just the American timeline, but the global timeline for the origin of humans capable of making such tools.
And Steen McIntyre faced difficulties too.
According to the sources, yes. She reported significant problems getting the dating results published. There was pressure, she claimed, to accept much younger dates. She described delays, resistance, and ultimately negative consequences for her career.
What did she attribute this resistance to?
She's quoted in the sources describing it as the manipulation of scientific thought through the suppression of enigmatic data that just didn't fit the expected picture.
So it seems like a recurring narrative in the sources. Evidence of modern-looking tools found in geological contexts suggesting great age meets strong resistance, and the researchers involved face professional difficulties.
That's certainly the pattern highlighted.
And this connects back to those California gold mine discoveries by J.D. Whitney we mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Whitney, who was the state geologist of California, reported numerous finds of quite advanced stone tools, spear points, stone mortars, and pestles found deep within mine shafts, often hundreds of feet down, underneath thick, undisturbed layers of ancient volcanic lava.
And those lava layers gave very old dates.
Modern dating methods applied to those overlying volcanic layers suggest ages ranging from 9 million up to over 55 million years old.
Mortars and pestles. 9 million years ago. Or older.
That's the implication of Whitney's findings, presented as further evidence for this pattern of advanced human technology existing in deep geological time. And remember, it was Whitney's finds that prompted W.H. Holmes's remark about discarding facts that don't fit the theory.
Right. Okay, so we've looked at worked bones and shells, crude tools, advanced tools. What about the most direct evidence? Actual human skeletal remains. Did they find bones that look like modern humans in these really old layers?
This is maybe the most controversial category. The sources highlight several cases, but a key one is from Castanedolo, Italy.
What was found there?
In the 1870s and 1880s, a geologist named G. Ragazzoni discovered fossil bone skulls, other skeletal parts belonging to several individuals. And these bones were identified at the time and reportedly confirmed by later anatomists as being indistinguishable from anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapiens.
Okay, modern human bones. How old were the layers they were found in?
They were found in Pliocene strata, dated to around 3 to 4 million years old.
Modern human skeletons, 3 to 4 million years old.
That was the report. Now, the immediate objection then and now to finding modern-looking bones in such old layers is usually intrusive burial, meaning someone died much more recently and was buried down into the older layer, mixing the bones.
Right, that makes sense as a first thought. How do the sources address that for Castanedolo?
They emphasized that Ragazzoni was a professional geologist, familiar with the local stratigraphy. He specifically examined the layers above where the skeletons were found, and he reported finding those overlying layers completely intact and undisturbed. He argued forcefully, based on his direct geological observations, that these could not have been later burials dug down from a higher level. The skeletons, he claimed, were deposited contemporaneously with the Pliocene sediments.
So he ruled out burial based on the geology.
That was his professional conclusion, yes. The sources also critique some later attempts to redate the bones themselves using radiometric or chemical methods, which gave much younger ages.
Why do they critique those later dates?
They suggest potential problems like contamination of the bones over time, which can skew those kinds of tests, especially on older material. They argue that in a case like this, the primary geological context evidence, the undisturbed layers observed by a competent geologist at the time of discovery, might actually be more reliable than later lab tests on potentially altered bones.
And the reaction from the scientific community at the time and later was skeptical.
Highly skeptical. The sources pull some pretty strong quotes to illustrate the resistance. An anatomist named G. Sergey, writing in 1884 about these and similar finds, complained of a despotic scientific prejudice against accepting evidence for such ancient humans.
Despotic scientific prejudice.
And even more tellingly, R.A.S. McAllister, writing a textbook on archaeology in 1921, discussed the Castanedolo finds and basically said that accepting them as genuinely Pliocene would create so many insoluble problems for the established theory of human evolution that we can hardly hesitate rejecting their authenticity.
So reject the evidence because it creates problems for the theory.
He essentially concluded there must be something wrong somewhere with the evidence because the theory couldn't accommodate it.
That sounds exactly like the knowledge filter in action, prioritizing the theoretical framework over potentially contradictory observations. Okay, so that covers the kind of evidence presented in Part 1 of the book. In Part 2, you mentioned they turn things around and critique the accepted evidence for human evolution.
Yes, they apply the same kind of critical scrutiny to the famous fossils that do form the basis of the standard human evolutionary tree fossils like Java man, Peking man, Australopithecus.
And what's their overall point in doing that?
They argued that if you apply the same extremely high standards of proof and skepticism to the accepted fossils as are applied to the anomalous ones, then much of the accepted evidence starts to look questionable too. And, they suggest, some of the accepted finds might even contain overlooked evidence supporting their own thesis of great human antiquity.
Okay, let's take Java man. Discovered by Eugene Dubois, considered a key Homo erectus find, right? How do they critique that?
Right, Java man, Pithecanthropus erectus then, Homo erectus now, was found in the 1890s, dated to the Middle Pleistocene, maybe 800,000 years ago. It was hailed as a missing link.
And the authors suggest its acceptance helped push the older evidence out.
They argue that as finds like Java man became accepted as representing the human lineage at that time, the older evidence for more modern-looking humans simply didn't fit the picture anymore and gradually faded from scientific discourse. It didn't make sense if Homo erectus was supposed to be our ancestor back then.
What are their specific criticisms of the Java man fossils themselves?
Well, first, they point out that the famous skull cap and the femur, thigh bone, that Dubois assigned to the same individual were actually found quite a distance apart, about 45 feet, according to the records in a bone bed containing many other animal fossils.
So maybe they didn't belong to the same creature?
That's a question they raise. But more significantly, they highlight a detailed anatomical study done in 1973 by Day and Mollison.
And what did that study find?
It concluded that the Java man femur was, in its morphology, essentially indistinguishable from that of a modern human, Homo sapiens sapiens. It didn't show the features expected of a Homo erectus femur.
Wait, a modern human thigh bone found in the same 800,000-year-old layers as a Homo erectus skull cap.
That's the implication they draw from that analysis. If correct, it would suggest that anatomically modern humans might have been living in Java alongside Homo erectus nearly 1 million years ago, which supports their core thesis of coexistence and great antiquity.
Any other issues with Java man?
They also note that many of the subsequent Java Homo erectus finds were surface finds, not excavated from clearly defined layers. Their dating often relies on associating them with nearby volcanic deposits, which can be less certain if the fossils weren't found in situ beneath undisturbed volcanic layers.
Okay. The sources also mention the Piltdown hoax in this context.
Yes, they discuss Piltdown, the infamous fake fossil combining a human-like skull with an ape-like jaw, which fooled scientists for decades. They use it partly to show that the scientific establishment can be fooled, but they contrast this deliberate fraud with what they see as the more subtle, systemic process of knowledge filtration acting on genuine but anomalous evidence.
But they also raise a weird point about the Piltdown skull itself.
Yeah, it's a bit speculative, but they mention the possibility, raised by some researchers after the hoax was exposed, that the skull part of Piltdown, unlike the jaw, might have been a genuinely ancient and unusually thick but anatomically modern human skull found in Britain, which would still be anomalous for the age and location initially claimed. So even within the hoax, there might have been a genuine anomaly.
Interesting twist. What about Peking Man, another famous Homo erectus? Any critiques there?
Their main critique regarding Peking Man and other hominid finds in China relates to dating methods. They argue that sometimes a practice they call morphological dating seems to be employed.
Morphological dating? What's that?
It's the idea that the age of a site or geological layer is sometimes determined, or at least heavily influenced, by how primitive or advanced the hominid fossils found there look, based on where they are assumed to fit in the evolutionary sequence.
Instead of dating based purely on the geology or the associated animal fossils.
Yeah. Right. They argue that the assumed evolutionary grade of the hominid itself is sometimes used to assign a date, rather than letting the independent geological or faunal evidence speak for itself.
That sounds circular. You're assuming the evolutionary sequence to date the fossils that are supposed to prove the sequence.
That's exactly their criticism. They argue it can create a self-reinforcing loop and potentially distort the true picture of when different hominids were present. They give an example from a site called Tongzi.
What happened at Tongzi?
Fossils identified as Homo sapiens were found there. The associated animal fossils, the fauna, suggested a middle to upper Pleistocene age quite old, but, the authors claim, the site was ultimately assigned a younger date, more consistent with when Homo sapiens was expected to be in that region based on its morphology.
So the animal evidence pointing to an older date was overridden by the appearance of the human fossils.
That's their interpretation of that case, and they suggest this happens elsewhere too.
And if you ignored this morphological dating and just looked at the geology and fauna across various Chinese sites, what picture emerges according to them?
They argue that the faunal evidence, taken as a whole, suggests that different types of hominids, including Homo erectus, early forms of Homo sapiens, Neanderthal-like hominids, and even fully anatomically modern Homo sapiens, may have actually coexisted in China much earlier than the standard timeline accepts, possibly going back well into the Middle Pleistocene.
Coexistence again instead of a simple linear progression.
Exactly. That's a recurring theme, coexistence over vast periods.
Finally, in their critique section, they look at Australopithecus, usually portrayed as our direct ancestor.
Yes. Species like Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, and africanus are generally placed on the direct line leading to Homo. But Cremo and Thompson highlight dissenting views within paleoanthropology itself.
Like whose views?
They focus particularly on the work of Charles E. Oxnard, a respected anatomist who performed detailed statistical analyses, multivariate morphometrics, on Australopithecine bones compared to apes and humans.
And what did Oxnard conclude?
Oxnard argued that, based on his analyses of various parts of the skeleton, shoulder, pelvis, hand, foot, the Australopithecines were quite distinct anatomically from both modern humans and modern African apes. He suggested they might have had a unique form of locomotion, possibly involving climbing in trees, and were likely an extinct side branch, not direct human ancestors.
An evolutionary dead end, not on our line.
That was his conclusion based on his anatomical studies. And the sources mention Oxnard felt his evidence, which contradicted the growing consensus that Australopithecines were human ancestors, faced resistance.
He felt it was suppressed.
The book includes a quote where Oxnard reflects that evidence pointing in other directions tended to get buried once the ancestor hypothesis won the day within the field. Another instance, they suggest, of the knowledge filter favoring the dominant narrative.
And this links back to those late Toli footprints in Tanzania, doesn't it? The really old, very human-looking footprints.
It does. Those footprints are dated to about 3.6 million years ago. They look remarkably like modern human footprints.
But the only hominin known for sure from that time and place is Australopithecus afarensis Lucy's species.
Exactly. So there's a paradox. If Australopithecus was the only hominin around, but its foot, according to researchers like Oxnard and others, was still adapted for climbing and not fully human-like, then who made those very modern-looking footprints?
It creates a puzzle for the standard model.
It does. Cremo and Thompson present it as another piece of evidence that fits better with their idea that more human-like creatures might have been around much earlier, perhaps alongside Australopithecines.
Okay, beyond the evidence presented in scientific papers, even the controversial ones, do the sources mention any other types of anomalous finds, maybe things reported outside of formal channels?
Yes, they include a section on artifacts reported in historical accounts, sometimes in newspapers or mining journals that are even more out there, let's say.
Like what kinds of things? Give me some examples.
Well, there are accounts like a delicate gold chain reportedly found embedded within a lump of coal from Illinois, dated to the Carboniferous period around 300 million years old.
A gold chain in 300-million-year-old coal.
That's the report they cite. Also from Illinois, a report of a human skeleton found in rock layers said to be of similar age. And another one, a metallic vase, intricately inlaid with silver, supposedly blasted out of solid rock pudding stone near Boston, Massachusetts, estimated to be Precambrian, maybe 500 million years old or more.
These sound even harder to verify than the archaeological finds.
Oh, absolutely. These are often anecdotal historical reports lacking the detailed context of formal excavations, but the authors include them as part of the broader pattern of anomalies.
And the Klerksdorp spheres we mentioned earlier fit in here too.
They do. Those grooved metallic spheres found in pyrophyllite deposits in South Africa. The geological context is incredibly old, over 2 billion years.
2 billion.
Yes, and the sources state that metallurgical analysis couldn't find a natural explanation for the sphere's perfect shape and the parallel grooves encircling some of them, leading some to suggest intelligent manufacture.
At 2 billion years ago. That predates complex life itself in the standard view.
Immensely. The authors find this intriguing because, they note, this time frame aligns with cosmological timescales mentioned in ancient Indian texts, the Vedas, which speak of cycles of creation and life extending back billions of years. That Vedic perspective was actually the initial inspiration for their research.
Right, okay. So we have this vast controversial body of evidence from forbidden archaeology, arguing for extreme human antiquity. But shifting gears slightly, even within mainstream science today, the picture of human origins isn't static, is it? Other sources we looked at show it's getting more complex all the time.
Absolutely. Recent discoveries highlighted in other materials are constantly refining and sometimes significantly altering the conventional narrative, even if they don't go back millions of years.
Like the evidence for interbreeding between different ancient human groups.
Exactly. Genetic studies now show clear evidence that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other archaic groups, maybe around 300,000 years ago or even earlier in some cases. Our ancestry isn't a simple linear tree, it's more like a braided stream.
And we're still finding new potential human relatives.
Yes, discoveries like Homo naledi in South Africa, or the ongoing debate about species like Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, or maybe Homo juluensis in Asia around 300,000 years ago. It shows multiple distinct hominin lineages coexisting across the Old World relatively recently.
The timeline for sophisticated behaviors is also being pushed back.
Definitely. Things like the discovery of bone tools in Tanzania, dated to 1.5 million years ago, suggest surprisingly early technological skills in hominins like Paranthropus boisei or early Homo.
And the peopling of the Americas is being reevaluated too.
Big time. Finds like stone tools and mastodon bones suggesting human activity in North America 130,000 years ago, or footprints dated to 23,000 years ago in New Mexico, are seriously challenging the old Clovis first model that put humans arriving only around 13,500 years ago.
Even symbolic thought or social complexity seems to be appearing earlier.
You could point to things like the Ashango bone from Central Africa, around 20,000, 25,000 years old. It has notches that some interpret as tally marks or even prime number sequences, suggesting early mathematical awareness.
And Göbekli Tepe.
Ah, yes, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Around 11,600 years old, 9600 BCE. It's currently the oldest known monumental temple complex in the world, built by hunter-gatherers before the invention of agriculture or pottery. It completely flipped the script on the idea that you needed farming surpluses to build complex societies and monumental architecture.
So even without going into the forbidden territory, the standard picture is becoming much more complex, nuanced, and often older than we thought just a few decades ago.
Absolutely. These mainstream discoveries show that human evolution and migration were far less straightforward than the simple diagram suggested. Our understanding is definitely not set in stone.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We've journeyed through millions, even billions of years of contested evidence, critiques of accepted fossils, and recent mainstream discoveries. What's the main takeaway for you, the listener, from this deep dive into these sources?
Well, I think the key thing is that the sources, especially forbidden archaeology, present this really significant, yes, highly controversial collection of data that directly challenges core assumptions about human history. Whether you accept the data or not, exploring it forces you to think.
And the idea of the knowledge filter.
Right. That concept, whether you agree with their specific examples or not, raises really important questions about how science works. How does a scientific community deal with data that doesn't fit? How is consensus formed? And what might get left out in that process?
So why should you care about exploring these anomalies and debates?
Because it's a fascinating case study in critical thinking about science itself. It encourages you to look at accepted knowledge with fresh eyes and consider that our understanding of the past, maybe even the fundamental story of who we are and where we came from, might be far less complete or certain than we usually think. And as we mentioned, the authors of Forbidden Archaeology were initially motivated by reading ancient Vedic texts from India, which describe human existence stretching back over vast cosmic cycles.
Which is interesting, the scientific hypothesis originating from an ancient religious or philosophical text.
Yeah, and they argue that their hypothesis that anatomically modern humans have existed for millions or hundreds of millions of years, coexisting with other hominids and creatures we thought long extinct, provides a framework that can actually accommodate all the evidence, both the accepted and the anomalous stuff they cataloged, in a way they feel the standard linear model can't.
It's certainly a radically different picture of our past. We've covered a huge amount here, from tiny carved shells to the structure of scientific debate itself.
It's definitely a lot to chew on, offering a perspective very different from the standard textbooks.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. Something to mull over, based on everything we've explored in these sources. If, as Cremo and Thompson argue, evidence that fundamentally challenges a dominant scientific theory can be systematically marginalized or forgotten, perhaps not through conspiracy, but through the inherent biases and social dynamics of how scientific knowledge is built, then what else might we be missing? What other aspects of our understanding, maybe not just about the deep past, but about history or health or society or even consciousness, might be obscured because the evidence doesn't neatly fit the prevailing story we've accepted as true? How much of what we know is shaped by what we're prepared to see?